Hello, Internet. I must tell you, I'm excited. We've got a pharmacist here, Major Kingston, Cuthbert, and he's from SAMS, in other words, from a medical services. And I've long been wanting to talk to somebody like that, so I'm really grateful that he contacted me. So welcome here. Thank you for your time. Your little dog is with you also. He's welcome too. And let me ask you, I mean, you're a professional man, so I suppose you were not part of a national serviceman, or perhaps you
Yes,
were. Can you tell
yes.
us, sir?
Thank you. I was called up for national service in July 1976. They told us we were candidate officers and we got issued little white bands that we wore on our epaulets. But in fact, when I finally got my little green book, we had been lieutenants from day one. But they felt it was better for training purposes that we didn't know this. Um, During basic training, the pharmacists were expected to do after hours work at the one military hospital in Voortrekkerhoogte, which was a little unfair because the other professionals did nothing else other than their basic training in the same time. But whatever, it's what happened. There was a shortage of pharmacists. The old one military hospital was a large, rambling place that sort of ran downhill, and you would enter the hospital and go downwards as you walk down passages. At night, it was very dark. We had to do after hours as well. Extremely dark and kind of spooky in its own little way. Those of us who did after hours work would have to stay at what they called the spoorcase. And the spoorcase was a house that stood on the hospital grounds. And this place never had a light burning at night time because people were sleeping there. It was just filled with beds lying in every corner. And you would have to enter this house, feel around until you found an empty bed, and then go to sleep until somebody came looking for you. And it was, I never saw the ghost, but they called it the spoorcase. My first superior after completing basic training was a certain Commandant or Lieutenant Colonel Ben Piller, whose surname, if I remember correctly, was Malan. He was recovering from a bout of endocarditis. Lovely man. Served there for about 2 months before I was sent to Southwest Africa, now called Namibia. And I was sent to 2 military area by Commandant Pinky Jacobs, who was the senior medical officer at Grootfontein. The main base for 2 military area was a town or a base at Runtu, which is on the border between Southwest and Angola. It sat a little bit back from the border, and the town itself sat pretty much on the border. When I got to Runtu, I discovered that I wasn't just the pharmacist for the 2 military area, but I was also the local state hospital pharmacist, where indeed I spent most of my time. This was quite an interesting experience in the sense that I had been registered as a pharmacist in January, and this was July, or soon after July. And I was dealing with a hospital. I was the pharmacist. There was no other pharmacist there. Incredibly hot in room 2. We were told that temperatures in Southwest could easily reach 45 degrees in the shade. I had a cold room, and I admit that from time to time I would step into the cold room just to get cool again. The aircon didn't work. The vehicle that I was supplied by the state hospital was in for repairs, and after about 2 weeks, the sick bay started moaning because they were having to transport me to the hospital every day. And it turned out that my vehicle had been declared beyond local repair. And the hospital gave me a Chev Commando. So here was this 2-pip lieutenant driving around in this huge car in Runtu. In fact, the MPs had to talk to me and tell me to slow down. They didn't like this big vehicle driving around the base. Then the hospital decided that this vehicle deserved to be given to one of the nursing staff instead. And I got a mine-protected Ford that was called, if I remember correctly, a spook. So we're back to ghosts again. This was a horrendous thing, V-shaped bodywork. You climbed up the back, went through a bulletproof door, down the what would have been the pan of the truck, and climbed into the single seat that was in front. And you were way above the ground. The gear lever was somewhere under my left leg. The advantage to driving the spook was that when I entered the base, the MPs never used to ask me where I'd come from, who I was, and so on, because they couldn't hear what I was saying, because I was so far above them, and I had solid bulletproof glass between me and them. This vehicle was taken away, and I was given a harvester, which I called the Happy Wanderer. The harvester was a nice enough little truck, but it would head down the road and then start angling off in a direction. And you countersteer and countersteer and countersteer, and then suddenly it would realize that you're countersteering, and it would swerve off in that direction, and you'd go at a sine wave down the road until it stabilized again. Drive okay for a while, and then it would start this all over again. But it was a nice thing. I used this vehicle to go to a place called Mashari. And I seem to remember Mashari is also where there was a leper colony. So I was dealing with diseases that we pretty much didn't get in South Africa. The national serviceman doctor who was in Mashari was a certain Dr. Peter Moore. And he and his medics had invited me and my medic for what we call a braai, a barbecue in American terminology. I got horrendously drunk. But I had to go back to Runtu base because I was on duty the next day. So we took the Happy Wanderer and off we went, and we took the bypass road that cut the Runtu town out. And in the dark, I suddenly came upon what we call Kavango robots. These are these peculiar long-horned cattle that the Kavango people have. And they were standing all over the road. How I got through them without hitting one, I have simply no idea. But I did, and all was well. I attended with the senior medical officer and other medical officers and the dentist to the Air Force pub. The reason how we got invited to the Air Force pub is the medics had a close cooperation with the South African Air Force, because from time to time we would have a patient who would need to be casevaced or sent back to a bigger institution further back down the line. And of course you used the Air Force. And we walked into the bar wearing our sidearms, and it normally in a military bar you don't wear sidearms, but the army was fairly relaxed about this. The Air Force, however, insisted, and we had to hand our sidearms in to the barman. Again, got senselessly drunk to the extent that none of us could identify our firearms afterward. So we each took a sidearm and went off to bed. The senior medical officer had, however, agreed with the commander of the base that we would attend the prayer meeting the next morning. So here were all these medics on parade, not feeling very well, and we had to go through what we call a lees en bid parade, where the chaplain would read something from the Bible and do a prayer. In any case, we managed to do that as well. I spent Christmas 1976 in Runtu. Our senior medical officer had been exchanged. He was a permanent force officer. He'd been exchanged, and we were in the gap where there was no senior medical officer. And I was picked to attend the base commander's Christmas dinner in Runtu town. And I met some interesting people while I was there, including the infamous Colonel Jan Breitenbach. After Runtu, I was assigned to 3 military hospital Tempe, Bloemfontein. Here again, it turned out that I was the only military pharmacist in the entire province. This is in the Free State in South Africa. My officer commanding at that time was a certain Colonel Tony Dippenaar. Absolutely brilliant man, strict but fair. He had laid down rules, and we would have to obey his rules unless you could convince him that the rule was wrong, in which case he would change the rule, which was then cast in stone again. But absolutely brilliant man, very eccentric, if I may say so. I mean, the first day I met him, he suddenly pulled a baby Browning out of his back pocket, which he carried with him when he was in his step-out uniform, other than bush uniform. Having mentioned Tony Dippenaar, I'm going to say that while I was in the medical services, South African medical services, I met a good number of what I would consider very interesting people, including Tony Dippenaar, General Neville Larkin, who is the chief of medical logistics for the South African medical services, and who was a pharmacist. He had been a navigator during the Second World War and was entitled to wear the half wings of a navigator on his army-style uniform that the medics wore at the time. Another person that I met was an Air Force officer, Lieutenant Colonel Commandant Fred Potgieter, who is commonly known as Fail Potty, which translates as Dirty Potty. This chap had been a fighter pilot in the Second World War. He'd been shot down in Italy. He fought in the Korean War. And there's a fairly famous photograph of Potty sitting in his Mustang with a bullet hole on the one side of the P8 canopy and the glass or perspex, whatever it was, taken out on the other side. This bullet, which is a 5.0 Browning or 12.7 millimeter shell, took the goggles off his face. And he came through totally unscathed. People like Brigadier Peter Ponzegro, again, Chief of Staff Intelligence. He was the guy who ran our computer systems. Absolutely lovely man, clever man, and I have the greatest respect for him. He eventually left the medics and he went to become a pastor of a church. Medics lost, churches gain. Then there were many other people, Major Mitch, who flew a C-130, Captain Oki, who flew a Dakota DC-3. 3 Mil was fairly quiet. On a particular Saturday morning, I went to 3 Mil from the officers' mess because I knew that the new 1 South African infantry was opening around the corner. I'd hardly got there, and they received an odd telephone call saying that a general was looking for asthma medication. What medication? I mean, there's so many asthma medications. So we didn't know what he wanted. So I took a selection of medicines, got a driver, went round to 1 SAI. A corporal there took me and we ran to one place. No, they hadn't been there yet. Ran to another place. No, they had already been there. So eventually he delivers me to a little hall and he says, look, just wait here. They'll get here sooner or later. In the hall were all the ladies dressed up in their finery and a Commandant van Deventer, who I knew. Tall man, very tall man, well over 6 foot tall. I mean, I'm 6'2". He was taller than me by a long chalk. And he sees to it that I have something to drink. And I drink my appetizer. I look out the window. As I look out the window, the guy passing by outside is P.W. Botha, who was then the Minister for Defense and later became the President of the Republic of South Africa. And with him is a bunch of very senior guys. So I decided, no, this is not what I want to do. So I started backing off. But Lieutenant Colonel or Commandant van Deventer grabs me by the arm and he says, come, drags me over to this lot and introduces me to them. I mean, he has this two-pip national serviceman being introduced to the people who are running the defense force of the Republic. It turns out that the general who was looking for medication was General Magnus Malan, chief of the defense force. And he didn't have asthma. He was looking for a product called Asmoral, which had nothing to do with asthma whatsoever. So I assured him I would get him some Asmoral and got out of there as fast as I could. Went back to 3 Mil, got the Asmoral, came back, and I found the caps lying on a table, looked for the one with the most on it, and left the Asmoral with that, got out of there. About P.W. Botha, he signed my original deed of commission. And over the years, his signature faded and faded and faded until it finally disappeared completely. So I had this deed of commission with no signature on it. And after he was ousted, he held a press conference in Wilderness, in the Southern Cape of South Africa. And I attended this conference. I was living in George at the time. And I took my deed with me. And when he got to questions and answers, I stuck my hand up and I said, look, I don't actually have a question. I'd just like to know, do you mind signing this again? And he did. What I can say about P.W. Botha is people may tell us about how bad he was and so forth, but he was a gentleman. The Air Force pilots who would fly him from one place to another would tell me that they'd fly him to some absolutely empty place where there was nobody and he was meeting with a big staff, and he would get off the plane and he would thank them for having brought him, go to them into the meeting and organize that the SAF guys who were standing outside would get something to eat and drink. And this is the sort of person he was. Not being either a doctor or a dentist, I was roped in to do officer on duty at 3 Military Hospital. And you would do this after hours and on weekends. And I have two particular memories. One was a patient had been put on a serious list. If I remember rightly, I think the patient had meningitis. The MO phoned the family. I, as duty officer, was not allowed to phone the family because this was a serious situation, a medical situation. However, the next day, the patient was taken off the serious list because he had improved so much. And I was allowed to phone the family. And that was for me a very moving experience to phone this family and tell them his son had improved enough that he had come off the serious list. I'm known as Patrick Cuthbert. Fine. I'm on duty one weekend, and 2 patients, AWOL, they go missing. So it's told to me 2 patients are missing. We run all over the place trying to find these patients. We eventually found them down at the nurse's home. And by this time, I'm annoyed, and I decide I'm going to charge them. So I asked the first one, name, rank, number. And the first thing that comes out of his mouth is Patrick Cuthbert. I said, don't be bloody funny with me. What's your name? He was Patrick Cuthbert. Told them to get back to the hospital, let it go at that. And doing genealogy afterwards, I discovered that yes, he was. And we were distantly related. While I was at 3 Military Hospital, my permanent force status came through. And I was promoted to captain. Not long after this, I was summoned to go to Surgeon General headquarters. The reason for my summoning was that General Neville Larkin decided that he was going to use me to open a medical sub-depot in Cape Town. And I needed to be trained for this purpose. The sub-depot was 1-4 medical sub-depot, and I was trained in the use of the military computer system called CONFOR, Consolidatie van Voorraad, consolidation of stock. And it was later changed to LIMS, Logistical Information Management System. And this was a mainframe system, meaning that we were connected by cable or telephone line to a center somewhere, be it Army headquarters or wherever. I think there were about 3 or 4 different centers. I never did a formal computer course. I did it by working with the machine. I also spent some time at 12 MSD, which was in Cape Town, in Durban. But in any case, I found CONFOR an absolutely brilliant system, and it engendered in me a love of computers. So I've worked with computers ever since 1977. As I said before, Brigadier Panzergro was the head of the intelligence department, and computers fell under his bailiwick. And while I was in Cape Town with 1-4 MSD, I had a problem which centered around the computers. So I phoned to speak to Brigadier Panzergro's sidekick, who was a Commandant Roux. Phoned Commandant Roux's number, and I got Brigadier Panzergro. So I apologized for disturbing him. He said, no, it wasn't a problem. What was the question? So I gave him my question, and the brigadier said to me, I don't know. I'll find out. And he did. And he phoned me the next day, and he gave me the answer. And that impressed me no end that a brigadier was prepared to admit that he didn't know what the answer to a question was. And not only that, he was prepared himself to phone me back and tell me what the answer was. The pharmaceutical staff at Surgeon General headquarters were General Larkin, Brigadier Francois de Toy, Colonel Senekal, Colonel R.A.M. Robertson, and a certain Commandant Robenheimer. The Chief of Staff personnel had an issue with pharmacists who could never quite understand why he had an issue with pharmacists. But he decided that pharmacists didn't warrant having rank. So a batch of national servicemen who came in were all made candidate officers, and they just stayed candidate officers. And we started finding state orders building up. So the general wanted to know, why are the national servicemen pharmacists not signing these orders? And they said, we can't, we're not officers. Why are you not officers? No, they don't know. This comes from Chief of Staff personnel. So General Larkin went down to Chief of Staff personnel and he said, "What's this?" "Oh, no, no, no. Pharmacists don't warrant having rank." They changed overnight. Now, I mentioned state orders. The whole point of the exercise was when the state decided they needed to source medical items, there was already an existing system, which was the medicals, SAMS, that was sourcing medical items. So General Larkin was tasked by Treasury to buy for the state, not for the Defence Force, for the state. And whatever we had did not become military equipment until it was issued to a military department or unit or whatever. So this was a very interesting situation. This convoy system used the NATO numbering system, where an item would have a single item identifying number. And as part of my work at Surgeon General is I started straightening these names up. I say straightening them up because different people had codified items at different times, and they'd used slightly different conventions. South Africa, the standard for medicine was the British Pharmacopoeia. Different pharmacopoeias have different standards. The names for certain medicines are different in America than they are under the British system. Examples of this is what we call paracetamol, the Americans call acetaminophen. So if somebody codifies the item and they call it acetaminophen, the rest of the state are not going to find paracetamol when they look for it. Then you had other things like spelling of hemostatic. The British system is HAE. The American system is HE. So you would find two similar forceps sitting 2 pages apart because the one is spelled forceps hemostatic, HE, another one is spelled forceps hemostatic, HAE. And I straightened these up so at least they appeared next to one another. The other one we had was epinephrine. Epinephrine in the British Pharmacopoeia is adrenaline. And the other state people were not finding adrenaline because it was under the name epinephrine. When it came to surgical stuff, the Americans call swabs sponge. So nobody could ever find the swabs because they were under sponge surgical. Got that sorted out. But it meant that I was physically working with this contour system, and I had a fairly intimate understanding of how it worked. I didn't know how to program it, but I knew how to work with it. When I finally got to Cape Town to open 14 MSD, the only state property that was big enough and available was what used to be the Ruland Street Jail in Cape Town. It was a largish jail. It figures in South African history so much that it even appears in some songs about the Ruland Street Jail. In any case, it had been vacated, and we got this jail that we set up 14 MSD in. Of course, now one of the state departments that used to draw of us was the prisons department. So wardens would come to fetch medicines and so forth, and they, knowing the place, took us through and showed us where various places were. In the women's quadrangle stood a house in the middle of the quadrangle, and this is the house where Marlene Leonberg stayed. Now, Marlene Leonberg was famous in our time for having committed a murder with a pair of scissors. She has since been released. She went to Polsmoor from Rowland Street. She has since been released. And of course, there's drama about it. Some people feel that she should never have been released. However, she served her time and she's been released. They even showed us where executions had been done at the time when Rowland Street still carried out executions. But there was nothing actually to be seen anymore. There was no hole in the floor or anything, no gallows, nothing like that. One of the prisons in the Cape Town area is the infamous Robben Island. This is where people like Nelson Mandela used to be. And they came to us the one day, bringing with them a prescription, gave us the prescription, which we didn't dispense per se, we issued medicine. And they said, could they get these original research medicines from us? Looked at the prescription and we said, no, we've got the generics. So they took the prescription away and had it dispensed at a private pharmacy. The prescription was for medicine for Nelson Mandela. That's as close as I got to Nelson Mandela. About August of 1978, Surgeon General headquarters started asking me if I was prepared to go and take over 15 MSD, which is the medical supply point for the South African Defence Force in Namibia, in Grootfontein. The person who was in charge there was a Commandant Ad Smit, and he had been there since the Defence Force had set up 15 MSD in Grootfontein. I was a little hesitant. I was sort of happy where I was safe and so on. But we had a holiday in September called Settlers Day, and I was phoned the first working day after the long weekend, and I was told at the end of the month I would be in Grootfontein. Commandant Smith's wife had contracted cerebral malaria and had died, and they were bringing him back to the Republic. Now, up to this point, I had only ever worked with medicine. That's what I was trained to do. I'm a pharmacist. In South African Defence Force parlance, a person who is a mechanic is known as a tiffy. And I was what they called a pill tiffy. So, in other words, a pill mechanic. When I got to Grootfontein, I discovered that I was no longer just a pill tiffy. I was responsible for anything that qualified as being medical. I'd been there about 2 or 3 weeks when the aforementioned Tony Dippenaar, who by now was a brigadier and chief of staff operations, came by, handed me a wad of handwritten top secret papers saying, see to it that this is ready in this period of time. It was 3 complete theaters. Now, when I say theaters, I mean tables, anesthetic machines, defibrillators, lights, surgical instruments, the whole shebang. And somewhere in Southwest Africa were these 3 theaters. I found them, I prepared them, and we were ready. But I had sleepless nights because amongst the records of things that had gone through 15 MSD were things like Cooley and DeBakey grafts, which are woven grafts used to replace blood vessels that have been damaged. And I didn't know which ones to order, and I was convinced some poor soldier was going to die on the table because I didn't have the right item at hand. It took me a long time to realize that you do what you can and what you understand, and things play out as they are. In actual fact, I'm unaware of anybody dying from neglect on this point. But yes, it was an interesting time because I was the only medical logistician for the entire operational area. I was handling medicine, surgical items, hygiene equipment, sutures, dental equipment, and right towards the end of my time there, finally body bags became my thing as well. Previously, they'd been handed by what was known as 16 maintenance. And for some odd reason, they decided these were a medical item as well. I came across a number of very interesting items, which we didn't have in the normal situation, if I can call it that. One of them was a thing called a Heimlich valve. And a Heimlich valve was a plastic thing which had a non-return valve in it. So when the soldier had hemorrhage into a chest, they would put a catheter in, connect the Heimlich valve to that, and connect a urine bag to the other end of the Heimlich valve. So blood and air could only go out of the chest and not be drawn back into the chest. We eventually managed to eliminate the Heimlich valve by using a urine bag that had a one-way valve built into it. So we could eliminate the urine bag completely. This Brigadier Tony Dippenaar, part of why I admire him is when the South African forces had been in Angola, he was the head of the surgical team in Angola. They did surgery literally in tents, and they would, from time to time, have a patient that they would read the books before going in and doing the surgery. And they did excellent surgery. They had incredibly low infection rates, and they were very successful. While Tony was in Angola, he found a Smith & Wesson 357 Magnum, which he smuggled back to the Republic and applied for a license once he had it back in the Republic. When he visited the operational area, he didn't, like the rest of us, wear a Star 9mm Parabellum. He wore his 357 Magnum. The senior medical officer for the operational area at that time was a Commander Harwood. Now, I say commander, at the time, the South African Medical Services would have people at different places. They would have them at an Air Force base. And very often those medical service people would wear an Air Force uniform. Or if they were at a naval base, they would wear a Navy uniform. The difference being that they would have a red stripe between the gold stripes on their epaulets, and they would carry naval rank. You would refer to them as commander or whatever, commodore or whatever. Commander Harwood, in keeping with his naval attachment, carried a dagger instead of a 9mm pistol. Eccentrics, I love them. All doctors in South Africa qualify as MB-CHB. So it's a Bachelor of Medicine and a Bachelor of Surgery. So they all have a certain amount of surgical experience and qualification. The surgeons we used in the operational area were national servicemen doctors, people who had recently qualified. But we used to get genuine surgeons, people who were specialist surgeons, who would come and they would spend 3 months with us. People like Dr. Alan White from Addington Hospital, Durban. Also an interesting character. A lovely little man was Captain Lawson, who was a professor of medicine. And Captain Lawson was such a lovely man. Tiny little guy, older man. He would come to Grootfontein and he would decide that evening he's going to go and play squash. Get dressed, put his racket under his arm, go off to the squash court, and here were all these 20-something-year-olds or younger playing squash there, and they would have this old man who had no idea who he was. And he would ask for somebody to play squash with him. And they would think, okay, he's an old man, we'll give him a couple of points. And they said, well, we'll give you this. Prof would accept it, fine. Go into play, and he would dominate the court. Stand in the middle, and he would control and make this guy run around and round in circles. He knew what he was doing. Also, a lovely chap. We had an occasion on Christmas Day, I think it was, where the prof walked into the sick bay at Grootfontein, and he found a huge crowd of patients waiting to be seen. And he said, what's going on here? And there was only one doctor who was seeing to the outpatients. And he said, where are the others? And he was told that no, they say because it's Christmas Day, it's a holiday, they don't have to appear. 10 minutes later, all those doctors were there and functioning. What was also interesting about Prof. Lawson is, like I say, he was a professor of surgery. We had an ops where these 3 theatres that I had, we moved up to Ondangwa in Novemberland, which is the main Air Force base in Novemberland, and we set up these 3 theatres. The triage officer was Professor Lawson. And they also sent up a whole team from one military hospital, people who were colonels and whatever. And it was, for me, rather amusing to have this 3-pip Captain Lawson, who was the triage officer, walking around and saying, we'll do this over here, we'll do that over there, and this bunch of big brass following him saying, yes, Professor, no, Professor, 3 bags full, Professor. Coming back to Tony Dippenaar, the place he was at where they had the surgical team, sort of a MASH, if you want to call it, was a place called Sela. And with the war going on in Angola, civilian refugees started turning up. So they made a refugee camp, and the South African Defence Force would look after them. We feed them, give them medical services, and so on. But now the civilians have a large number, half of them are women. So sooner or later, the women turn up and they start asking for feminine napkins. That's something they didn't have. So they sent an indent back to Pretoria. Nothing arrives. They sent a second indent to Pretoria. Nothing arrives. They sent a third indent to Pretoria. Just after that, they decide they can't have all these civilians in this war zone, so they got sent back to Southwest Africa. Then 3 consignments of feminine napkins turned up. Right. They didn't waste them. They sterilized them and used them as wound dressings. And for a little bit of amusement, a traveling chaplain turned up one day by road. And as he's leaving, he was moaning about the dust that he was going to be breathing until he got to the next base. So somebody said, well, take one of these, hands him a feminine napkin, and he says, loop it around your ears, and it'll filter the dust out of your face. And the chaplain was kind of interested, and then he said, no, he thinks not. And he was asked why, and he said, because somebody is going to look up the road and say, what is this coming down the road? So he decided he wasn't going to do that. Coming back to Runtu, 1976, we had all these refugees in the refugee camp outside of Runtu. They all spoke Portuguese, and they would come to the state hospital for treatment. And medicine would be prescribed for them, and I would have great difficulty in trying to explain to them how they're supposed to use their medication. But somebody before me had written a little note, and they'd put it up over the hatchway. giving the Portuguese for the various dosage formats. So I thought, okay, I can do this. So the next one I get, I laboriously write out the label in Portuguese, stick it on, hand it to the woman, and I say, un tres vise por Dio. Her face lit up, and she gabbles at me in Portuguese, of which I understand not a word. And I had to try and explain to her that I don't speak Portuguese. I only know how to give you a medication in Portuguese. Experiences I had at 1.5 MSD, when I was now permanent force. I got to go to places that a lot of other people never got to go to. I did things that other pharmacists pretty much never got to do. Places I went to were like Katima Malilu at the far end of the Caprivi Zipfel, Mpacha, which is the Air Force base at the far end of the Caprivi, Camp Alpha or Omega, which is in the Caprivi, a place called, it had two names, one was Ahumpaho, the other name was Apuva, which is in the far northwest of Southwest Africa. Very dry, very stony place. This is where the Himba people lived. The Himba were famous for taking ochre, mixing it with cow grease, and smearing it all over their bodies. So the buildings that were there were all painted red, brown, up to above shoulder height, because the Himba people would come and lean against the walls and mark them. So the only way they could hide it was having the wall the same color that they were. One of the other things that happened is Captain Oki, that I mentioned earlier, who flew a DC-3, invited me to go with him. He was doing a trip up to Ndangwa to collect school children to go back to hostel in Windhoek. The plane took off from Grootfontein, empty except for the flight crew and myself, and they left the back door off. I suffer from fear of heights, but again, it's a memory that will remain with me for the rest of my life, is flying over the Etosha Pan at daybreak as the sun is coming up, hanging out of this open hatch at the back of the plane. Very few scenes can match that particular scene. Military planes in the operational area had one of two approaches to the next venue. They would either fly extremely high and then do a rapid corkscrew. Once they were over the runway, do a rapid corkscrew and put down on the runway. Or they would fly just a little bit above treetop height. And this was to try and avoid SAM-7 missiles. This Captain Oki told me the one time that he was doing trooping from Grootfontein up into Wambeland, and they would take off, lock onto the beacon, and switch on the autopilot, at which time the flying crew would sit there reading their books, paying no attention to what's going on outside. A troop looks out of the plane and sees the trees just a little bit below him, goes up to the little curtain that divided off the cockpit, pulls back the curtain, and he finds the crew sitting there reading books with the trees just below. In any case, they were perfectly safe. This same little trick of using the beacon nearly cost the South African Defence Force very heavily. A staff group, these are people who are training to be generals, are going through the operational area and are being moved around by DC-3. They take off from Grootfontein to go to Ruakana. Pilot locks onto the beacon, and pays no further attention. All these big brass at the back, learner generals, are playing bridge. Eventually they feel, as the pilot takes over control of the plane, and they can feel the wheels, the landing gear come down, they decide they've got to finish off because they're going to land. All of a sudden, it sounds like heavy hail on a tin roof, and the plane swerves. He locked onto the wrong beacon. He was coming down on the wrong side of the border. He nearly cost the South African Defence Force an entire order group, staff group. Commandant Fail Potty. He comes to the sick bay at one time. He flew DC-3s. He was 60 something at the time. And he asks us if we had hand grenades. We say, no, we don't have hand grenades. What do you need hand grenades for? He got sick and tired of the tours taking pot shots at him flying his DC-3. And what he wanted to do was to swing around and drop hand grenades on them. We couldn't help him. When I was at 3 Military Hospital back in 1977, we got a new batch of national servicemen, doctors and dentists, including a Dr. Wang. And we were like, Wang? Okay. But when they turned up, none of them looked Asian. So we said, who's Dr. Wang? And a very Caucasian guy stepped forward because he wasn't Wang, he was Vong, as in Scandinavia. Okay. That was an interesting one we fell into. Another interesting person we had there was a Dr. Vernon Neppy. Vernon was one of those hyper-intelligent people who had done his speciality while he was doing his MBCHB. So he literally came in for national service as a specialist. He was a psychiatrist. And he was sent to 3 Military Hospital to be the military psychiatrist for the Free State Command. But he's also one of those people to whom other things not in his field of expertise are of no interest. So it was not interesting to him which way around his pips went on his epaulets. It was of no interest to him whether he was even wearing his rank. It was of no interest to him what collar and which way around the badges on his step-out uniform went. He was so otherworldly that when he walked from the outpatients department to the hospital proper, he would salute what we called a pioneer. A pioneer was a person who had been in the Defence Force, had passed retirement age, but was still needing an income. So they would function as a sort of lackey, uniformed lackey that would be in the base. And they had absolutely no rank whatsoever, but Vernon would salute them. Vernon is now a professor with a string of letters after his name that took 3 lines on a printed document. He now lives in America. A very interesting person. He taught me some things about pharmacy that I didn't know. I had 2 sessions at 15 MSD in Grootfontein. The first one was after taking over from Commandant Ad Smit. At that time, the depot was not computerized. It was all hand done. I'd had a year gap when I worked at Surgeon General again, and General Larkin asked me to go back to 15 MSD. Then we computerized it. And that was absolutely brilliant because we were able to reduce our stock holding to those things that we actually needed. And we were able to turn over about 3 million a month in value at that time, which today would be a lot more than 3 million. The second time after we had computerized, when I was at 15 MSD, we got a new batch of national servicemen medics. Now, national servicemen privates fell into one of two groups. They were just medics, or then there were those that we call ops company medics, who got pretty much an EMA, emergency medical assistance training in the field. And this bunch of medics that came to me were ops company medics. And I got the list of names. And going through the list, I spot a J.P. Ray, R-E-Y. Now, this is a name I recognized because when I had done my apprenticeship, the pharmacy I did it at had a family that had an account at the pharmacy, which was the Ray family. And I learned that one of the sons, Mickey Ray, had married a particular woman. So what are the chances? I go out and I say, right, who's J.P. Ray? And there's one chap, he steps forward. And I asked him, I said, is your mother Penny Coolen? Penny Coolen was the South African beauty queen who was, I think, Miss Universe. And he was. And in fact, his brother was a lieutenant down at 16 Maintenance Unit in the base. By this time, 15 MSD had moved out of the military base, and we had occupied what used to be the girls' hostel for the school in the town proper. Gave us a lot more space and gave us a place to put our computers, which we didn't really have down in the base. In fact, in the base, we occupied what was supposed to have been the laboratory for the sick bay. Now we had more space and were able to do our own thing. We managed to get Penny Coolen and her husband, Mickey Ray, to come and tour the operational area, which was interesting in its own too. Lovely person, brought up her sons very well. I've now spoken about officers that we had, but I'd like to mention two medics that I came across. All of them were pretty much very nice youngsters and so on. While I was attending order group at the sick bay at one stage, the matron was going on about some medic, Bucas. I had no idea who this Bucas was. It turned out that Bucas wasn't a medic. Bucas had gone in to be an infantryman. Trained, he did his training as an infantryman. He was sent up into the operational area where they suddenly discovered that maybe he shouldn't have done national service at all because he was not the brightest penny. So they passed him back from the base he was at to Oshakati in Novemberland. The army in Oshakati discovered that this guy wasn't able to function as they would like him to function. So they passed him to the medics at Oshakati. The medics at Oshakati passed him back to us at Grootfontein. And they tried to use him in the sick bay and decided he wasn't suitable, and the matron was going off about him. So I said, I'll tell you what, if you don't want him, I'll take him. She tried a trick. She wanted one of my medics in turn. I said, no. You wanted to send him back to the Republic. You were prepared to give him up. I'm taking him, and you're not getting one of my medics. And little Bucas was one of those Afrikaans kids that have been brought up very respectfully, very politely. Very nice young man. He just wasn't particularly bright. If you gave him something to do, give him one piece of the job at a time. Don't complicate the issue. And he was fine. I went on a visit to Vamberland for some reason at one stage, and I took Bucas with me as my protective, I can call it that. Stopped at one of the bases, introduced myself to the officer commanding, and Lucas stepped forward and he said, Lucas, and he shook the officer commanding's hand as well. But he was such a polite, nice young man. Here again, I'm going to mention something that happened in the South African Defence Force that probably doesn't happen in other defence forces around the world. You see, probably the only defence force where a soldier, a private, could get away by calling his officer uncle. It's also the only defence force where an officer would speak to a private and say, seun, son. Another medic I'd like to mention here was Darby de Wet. When I was at 3 Military Hospital, I had this youngster. He had a damaged, he had an injured hip. So he was a G4. He was not allowed to go to the operational area. So he got sent to me as a medic to work in the pharmacy. Absolutely lovely youngster. Came from De Wetsdorp, oddly enough, in the Free State. Again, as I say, one of those Afrikaans children who had been brought up with the intense politeness that Afrikaans children can have. Do you have any questions?
I have to say I've got a lot of questions, actually, if you don't mind that. The first question would be, would you be from a medical family, sir?
No. I'm a South African child. I'm a second generation paternally. My grandmother and grandfather came from Ireland. My father failed matric. He was a clerk on the South African railways. My mother completed matric, wanted to go to university, but the money was not there. My mother was a De Bruin. She was an Afrikaans family, multi-generational Afrikaans family, to the extent that her father had fought the British during the Second Anglo-Boer War. He was one of Combat General De Wet's men. He was captured. He was sent to Camp Diatalawa in what was then Ceylon and is now Sri Lanka. My mother's mother, my Oma, that's the Afrikaans term for grandmother. My Oma was taken by the British and put into the Kroonstad concentration camp, where she lost her first three children. So my mother's first 3 brothers died at the Kroonstad concentration camp. So no medical background whatsoever. I had sort of wanted to be a vet, but the only place that trained vets in South Africa was a place called Onderstepoort in Pretoria, and I grew up in Durban in Natal, which is very far away from Pretoria. So we had a school of pharmacy in Durban, the Natal College for Advanced Technical Education, and I did the South African Pharmacy Board's diploma course and qualified as a pharmacist in Durban. I wrote 1975. I was registered on the 1st of January 1976 as a pharmacist.
Yeah, I was about to ask about how a pharmacist is trained. I think that's what they call in America a druggist or something like that. I always found it very amusing, that word. But it's the same thing. It's a professional qualification.
Yes, we had 2 qualifications in South Africa. You either got a Dip-Pharm, which is what I have, a diploma in pharmacy, which meant that you were qualified by the Pharmacy Council to be a pharmacist. You wrote their exam and you registered as a pharmacist. Or you did, originally was a B-Pharm, BSc farm, and it was later changed to B farm, in which case you went to somewhere like Grahamstown and you did your course as a bachelor course with the university. Interestingly enough, this was one of the things that Chief of Medical Staff personnel held against us. They said that pharmacists who had a diploma were not qualified to have rank. And when General Larkin found out about this, he went to chat to them about it. And they said, yes, they don't have a degree, so they can't have rank. They're not as good as the degree people. So General Larkin said, okay, Chief of Medical Staff Logistics, General Larkin, Dip Farm. Brigadier de Toy, Dip Farm. Colonel Senecal, Dip Farm. Colonel Robertson, Dip Farm. The Dip Farm pharmacists got their rank.
Yeah, I can see, this narrow-minded way of thinking. This is not a degree. In the old days in the legal profession, instead of having a degree and another degree, a postgraduate degree of LLB, some people just went into the state service and they got the same qualifications, which they called Hoërwet and Laerwet, higher law and lower law. And they saw it as exactly the same thing. But of course, they couldn't work with us outside the state system at all. So sometimes you see, well, I don't think any of them are practicing anymore. They must be too old. But do you think that this thing between degree and not degree, did it play a role, sir? Or was there a feeling between the pharmacists themselves?
We didn't ask. It never came up particularly as a subject between the pharmacists. I did have an experience, though. We had a pharmacist at the sick bay, Grootfontein, and I had a national service and pharmacist working with me in 15 MSD. And we had a gap at one stage where we had no aqueous cream. And the national service and pharmacist at the sick bay went off at me. He was a degreed pharmacist. He went off at me and said, how can you not have aqueous cream, blah, 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 blah. I said, well, why don't you make it? How is he supposed to make it? I said, emulsificants. And he looked at me, and I turned to my pharmacist. I said, can you make aqueous cream? He said, yes.
That's exactly my point. And I wanted to ask you about that. I find this extremely fascinating. I'm really glad you came here. What is the relationship between a doctor and a pharmacist? I mean, who's in charge here? Because what if this doctor writes out something which is, in your heart, you deal with pills every day. It might be outdated, or this patient might have other disease which he might, the pill can kill him.
Look, I wouldn't want to scratch in a doctor's salad. However, yes, sometimes a pharmacist has experience on something which the doctor hasn't got. One of the things that I discovered working with the military was proteolytic enzymes. It's an enzyme that you either get from pawpaws or from pineapples. And it will aid in reducing swelling. So if you have dental work and your mouth swells up, you take the proteolytic enzyme and the swelling goes down. And I could never get any doctors to actually use it, all the dentists to use it. They all looked at me and they went their own way. I use proteolytic enzymes. They work like a charm. I'm quite happy. But when I was a student, I met a doctor in Durban who was a neurosurgeon, brain surgeon, Dr. Mauritius Joubert. And when I was living in George, I discovered that the brain surgeon they had at the local clinic was Dr. Mauritius Joubert. Sorry, Professor Mauritius Joubert. And he was happy to get advice on medicine. And I find this interesting that when the guy really knows, when he's really trained, he's prepared to take advice or to get information. Where I think sometimes when you got the standard qualification, you don't take advice from anybody, you give advice. But most of the time, we got on well with the doctors and so on. One of the last courses I did with the military was a thing called vechtgroep. And vechtgroep was supposed to teach us how to command a medical battalion group. The medical battalion group is a huge thing. It's all the ambulances, it's mobile theaters, it's a mobile pharmacy, it's mobile cooking facilities, offices, the whole thing that would allow a mobile hospital to function as a unit by itself in the field. And we, all of us, the pen pushers, the hygiene officers, the dental officers, pharmacist officers, and so on, would all have to do the vechtgroep course, which is now supposed to qualify us to be colonels and above, and to command a medical battalion group. But only a doctor can command a medical battalion group.
Yeah, I have to say that makes no sense. I mean, it's got nothing to do with his medical skills. This is admin. This is being able to, probably at Luatla, one of those places where you would learn this type of thing.
And I mentioned earlier, I said we wore the army style uniform, except that we wore a maroon tie. We wore gold regalia badges and buttons, and the army were wearing chrome. And if you were Air Force, you wore Air Force uniform. If you were Navy, you wore the Navy uniform. Then we got a new Surgeon General, General Knubel. And under General Knubel's command, they changed the uniform. The uniform ended up looking very much like the Bundeswehr in Germany. It was a grey tunic and dark trousers with a maroon beret and a maroon tie. We kept the maroon tie. The badge has changed completely. I kind of think we lost something at that stage. The medical services had been a fourth arm of the Defence Force, but not entirely a fourth arm. So certain functions were carried out by the army. And when we broke away 100% from the army, we made some mistakes. The first mistake was that our intake of national servicemen had been controlled by the army. And the medics sat back and they waited for the new intake and nobody arrived. When they ran around saying, what happened to our intake? The army said, well, you didn't do anything about them, so we took them. So we lost an entire intake of national servicemen because we were not properly ready to be 100% independent. Which also now meant that the medics had to run around and try and find officers from somewhere to do these things that had been done by the army. And with this, things went a little wrong. But that's another story.
I want to ask you, Major, there's a lot of people who is looking back in history, and of course, they don't know, they haven't been there, so we have to educate them. The medical services, would they treat enemy soldiers as well as the local population, besides the own army?
I was sort of avoiding that a little bit. We would treat civilians. There's no hesitation about that. But talking about enemy, I spoke about Professor Lawson doing triage. Now, triage is a selection of patients in terms of when they're going to be treated. So the professor would look at a patient and he would see that this patient needs treatment and he's got a good chance of survival. That's the first patient you see. He would look at another patient, and this patient he's got an injury, but he can wait a little bit. That's your second one. He would look at a patient, and this patient is bad, but his chances of survival are so poor that he becomes stage 3. They also did a fourth category, and that was enemy. So the enemy, irrespective of whatever, was the fourth category. Whether they will admit to that today, I don't know.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. But it's done upon biological wounds. I mean, this isn't done on race. This is done on, look, the guy's so seriously wounded, we can't save him. We don't have time. These are not normal circumstances.
You don't want to waste your medical officer's time or your surgeon's time trying to save somebody who's probably not going to make it. So you do what you can. You have somebody relatively down the line dealing with him, plugging holes, making sure that he's got a fluid line and so on. But you're not going to waste surgical time. You've got to save the guy who's got a good chance. Save the guy who's sort of okay, but he's got a good chance. Then you look after the people who probably not going to make it.
But now
I was going to say we had odd things happen. This on Dongwo, the Air Force base, the Tuffies, the mechanic guys, decided the sergeant major decided they needed to clean the floor. The floor become very greasy. So what they did is they threw petrol on the floor, stiff brooms, and these guys were scrubbing the floor with petrol. And some idiot lit up a cigarette. So of course, this whole building just went poof. We had a bad time. They casevaced them to Grootfontein, and we had these burn patients in Grootfontein. It was terrible because now not only were they burnt on the skin, what happens is when this air goes full of flame in front of you, people tend to go, and they suck flames into their lungs. So they were burnt in their lungs. On top of which, many of them were wearing underwear, which is not military underwear. It was civilian underwear, and is made with nylon. So it melted onto them. That was absolutely horrendous, that. Another patient we had that was very interesting is around the area of Grootfontein, they had tracked some terrorists, and they had one of them behind a rock, and they couldn't get this guy out from the rock. We were using FAL rifles, R1 rifles, what we call an FN rifle. It's a 7.62 millimeter, very powerful weapon. So they said, okay. They had guys loading magazines. The chap would put the magazine on, and he shot that rock piece by piece until the guy was exposed, at which time he gave up. Fine. So now they have this guy, but when they got him, he was about 14. And they admitted him to the sick bay because he received a couple of injuries in the process. And I went around to look at the poor guy, big round eyes. I had a look at his x-rays. It didn't matter what part of the x-rayed. When you held it up, with tiny little spicules throughout his body, which were pieces of metal and pieces of rock that had been splintered off and had penetrated his flesh. I have no idea what happened to him, but I think he went down the line. Oh, I got to have supper with Lieutenant Bomber. Lieutenant Bomber was a socialist pilot. I think he was flying a MiG-15 who AWOL'd from Mozambique and landed on a South African Air Force base in his fishbed MiG. And I got to have supper with him at the Manhattan Hotel in Pretoria. So, yeah, that's what I say. You get to do things that the average pharmacist doesn't do. I'm trying to think of other patients that we had. Amongst the anesthetics we had, this is in the days when pentothal was still available. Pentothal is no longer available. Most patients were induced to surgery with pentothal. Otherwise, another thing called Fabantal, and there was another one called Propofol. But one of the anesthetic things we had was Ketalar, known as the active ingredient is ketamine. But most of the guys would try and avoid using Ketalar because adults often had bad trips with it. Interesting stuff. You put a bloke out on the table and he's sort of awake, his eyes are open, he's got a cough reflex, he's got a swallow reflex, which they lose otherwise. And if you sing something very simple like Happy Birthday, he'll sing along with you. Interesting stuff. I only know one patient that was put out with Ketalar, and I spoke to him afterwards, and he said it was terrible. He found himself alone in the world, and the world was just vastly empty and flat, and there was nobody else. So I think it doesn't go well with adults, but we had the stuff. Another patient we had, it was a SADFO, South African Defence Force order, that you were not to play around with snakes and so on. And of course, troops are troops, they play with snakes. Big rush at Grootfontein, they carry this bloke in, and we say, right, what's happened? He's been bitten by a snake. So we say, okay, what snake was it? Oh, that's back there. Okay, bring us the snake. They brought us this thing. It was about the size of a pencil, and it was completely flat. We couldn't make anything out because they killed the snake. It was greenish, so we thought it might be what they call a boomslang, a tree snake. A tree snake is a back fang snake. Its poison fangs are at the back, and its poison affects the blood, that the blood can't clot. The South African Institute of Medical Research had an antivenom for boomslang, which they would not supply unless it was a confirmed boomslang bite. So we telex down to Pretoria, we say we want boomslang antivenom. How do you know it's a boomslang? Well, we said, well, that's what we got. They said they're not convinced. They want us to monitor the patient. So right through the night, every half an hour, they wake the patient, stick a hole in his finger, and check to see if his blood clotted. He never had any problems. We put this mangled snake into alcohol, sent it down to the Republic, and the confirmation came back is that it was a non-poisonous snake of some sort. Bird snake, a non-poisonous bird snake. So they did the right thing by not sending us their antivenom. Apropos antivenom, we learned in the military, we had antivenom for mamba. It was a general antivenom for mamba, cobra, and so on. And we would rather not use it. If somebody got bitten by a snake, you treat it symptomatically, or you get a whacking dose of cortisone and treated them symptomatically. Antihistamine, cortisone, that's it. And we had no losses to snakebite, none whatsoever. Going back to the R1, the 7.62 rifle, we would have troops who decided they didn't want to go into battle. So they would either shoot themselves through the foot or through the hand, not realizing that this is an incredibly powerful weapon. It has a shock wave around the bullet about the size of a dinner plate. So when they shot themselves through the hand, they didn't have a 7.62 hole through their hand. The cells in the hand were destroyed. So the patient would probably lose his entire hand. Guys got up to other things. They would either eat plastic explosive, PE4, or they would eat cordite from the bullet, which would push their blood pressure up and giving them a hell of a headache. Not a good idea. I just thought of something else. In the Republic, we had a major medical depot, which was called Medical Base Depot, or rather Central Medical Stores, which is later called Medical Base Depot. And MBD used to make medicines, which they packed in liter bottles. And one of these was a thing called Mist Diabolica, which is Latin to say a diabolical mixture. If you thought your patient was lead swinging, you gave him a dose of Mist Diabolica, which tasted terrible, absolutely terrible. Did absolutely nothing to him, but it tasted terrible. We got a chappie permanent force officer at MBD who used to do quality assurance. So he would test things that we bought for the state. And at one point we had a problem. We were buying family planning stuff for the state too. And of course, amongst the family planning were condoms. And something was wrong with the batch. So that entire batch was put off to one side and we got other stock in, which we were issuing to state. And Brigadier Dutoy was officer commanding MBD. And somewhere along the line, he would have a national serviceman come to him and ask for time off and permission to go and marry. Fine. This would be followed by another one shortly afterwards. Okay. And eventually the brigadier said, what's happening? And these guys were snaffling the condoms, which were faulty. So they were ending it up in having to go and get married. At MBD, we had dental drills that came from First and Second World War. These things were foot operated. The dentist would pedal this thing and that would make the drill work. In our uniform, we had a large pocket on the front. And this pocket was about that size. And its purpose was not for money. Its purpose was to hold a wound dressing, a shell dressing. And the shell dressing you carried was your shell dressing. If you got injured, your friend would take your shell dressing, open it up, and dress your wound with it. And we had a problem getting shell dressings. But we had shell dressings that dated from the First World War. I have two of them knocking around somewhere. They were dated 1914, 1915. And we said, okay, we have these, but are they sterile? They were assayed for sterility. We issued them. They were still sterile after all those decades. In fact, they weren't even made for the South African Defence Force. They were made for the Union Defence Force. So that goes way, way back. We had morphine. The morphine came in a little metal container like a cigarette case. little glass vials, tiny little glass vials with these tiny little white tablets in it, each one being a quarter grain of morphine, which is an old-fashioned pharmaceutical mass. And the idea was that the soldier and the medic in the field would need to inject his patient with morphine. The only water he's got is in his water bottle or whatever was available. So what he would do is you draw some water up in the syringe, take one of these pills, drop it inside, put the plunger back in, shake it, and then inject it. It wasn't perhaps very sterile, but it worked. South African Defence Force, the South African Air Force had Mirage jets. When we bought these jets from the French supplied some morphine with it for the pilots, because the pilot carries his own medical kit with him. And these were like eye ointment tubes in a little case with a needle on the front and a wire down the needle. If a pilot had to eject and he was down and he had an injury which was extremely painful, he would open the case, push the wire in, and that would break a seal on the inside, take the wire out, stick the thing in his leg, and squeeze the tube, and that would inject the morphine into him. Other medical things. We had quinine injections at Medical Base Depot. These quinine was so old, they predated the time where medicines were required to carry an expiry date. A patient was at a state hospital and he had a malaria that we're finding was resistant. So they contacted us and said, did we have quinine? We got our quinine out. There's no expiry date. We had it assayed and it seemed to be okay. There was extremely small granules, which is the glass starting to decompose, as it were, inside. And we said, look, we have this. You're welcome to use it or not. It's your choice. And as far as I know, they used it and it worked just fine. When we were in Southwest, malaria, like I say, Ot Smith's wife died from cerebral malaria. We had to take weekly doses of Daraclor to avoid malaria. And it was quite a thing. We would have a leesenbit parade at the sick bay, and we'd say to the medics, who's taken their Daraclor? And the stuff was terribly bitter. So it'd be somebody, and we'd go and say, right, take your Daraclor now while we stand here. But we had cases from time to time in the military. Not a medical item, but it was something that happened in the operational area. A telegram came through, outside base, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Telegram comes through, telex comes through for one of the medics, or one of the troops. Boetie oorlede, brother is dead. They don't ask the guy anything about this. They pack him up with his kit and they send him back to the Republic. What they didn't know is Boetie was a budgie, a parakeet. So the chap got to go back home with for a budgie that had died, and he wasn't going to tell them either. What else can I say?
I can perhaps ask you something here, if you don't mind.
Yes.
You said to me that the aircons didn't work well there when you first went, I think, to Grootfontein or one of those places. My question would be, is with these medicines, the modern ones, would something happen to them if they get too warm or too hot? Perhaps in the sun or something like that?
Interesting you should ask that. We had fridges, which were gas fridges. And these gas fridges used to run out of gas. We would come in the morning and there'd be puddles of water Now, we had heat-sensitive stuff like insulin and the anti-snakebite serums. Now, what do? Do we throw the stuff away? So we would just keep it, put a new bottle on, and carry on. Worse than that, medical base depot would put together, once we had contour and so on, they would get a document, the Surgeon General, saying, send this to us. Okay, we would set the level at which it would reorder. And we would get stock from medical base depot sent to us by rail. If you have a look at a map of South Africa, you'll find that Pretoria is in the Transvaal, and the rail line runs south, 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 Northern Cape, Uppington, back all the way through Southwest Africa to Grootfontein, which was the railhead. And the train would take 3 weeks to get to us from Pretoria. In the consignment would be our insulin. Now, it's the only insulin we have, so we can't chuck it away. Never had a problem. Never, ever. So, yes, the question about the heat.
So it's a matter of practical experience and just being practical. I mean, you have a need for these medicines, they're still working, as far as we know.
Yeah.
So you're not really hurting any patient. But there's one illness which, of course, we all suffered from, which is called Zippo. And for those people who don't understand this, it has no respect for any rank or any person. And man, it's hard to get out of your uniform with all your kit off and to get behind the closest tree or wherever, because once it comes, it comes. It comes. I know about one fellow, it was Peter Williams from 32 Battalion. He said he walked for 2 days without pants on patrol. And then
that sounds like the British. Yeah, the British troops did this in the Middle East, not Middle East, in Asia during the Second World War. The British troops stopped wearing underwear. They would take the bayonet, they would slice the seat of their shorts so it was open, so that if they needed to go, they just sat down and they did it. We issued an awful lot of a product called Lomotil, diphenoxylate and atropine, to control Zippo guts. In fact, we had a mess, a substantial building in Grootfontein, which was divided into other ranks, Army officers, Air Force officers. The Air Force liked to be independent. And we got a crowd of brass up from Pretoria about the mess. And I was on the mess committee. So the mess committee and this crowd of brass were put into a room by ourselves, and they supplied us this beautiful lunch. Fine. The next day, the sick bay could not keep up with the Lomotil that we were issuing. The kitchen had prepared chicken the day before. They had those huge pots where they would do the chicken in, and they let it cool in the pots and then just warmed it up for lunch. So it was completely septic. They poisoned the entire base except the group that had had the special meal. We got away with it. But yeah.
I was
one of
also
my first jobs on the mess committee is the bread we got was terrible. It was inedible, absolutely inedible. And we were having this committee meeting, and somebody complained. They said, they don't know what to do. They're throwing all this bread away. I said, why is the bread so bad? And it turned out that what they were doing is they were buying from the local Bäckerei, because it's now German bakery. They were buying the lowest quality bread. I said, look, how's this for an idea? Spend the same amount of money, buy less bread of a higher quality. And they tried it, and it worked. It's just that the bread was so bad that nobody would eat it. Well, about the chicken, I stopped eating chicken at the mess. They took steak, which was grade A steak, and they turned it into the most dreadful thing that we called a wombo stew. It was dreadful. And if it was a wombo stew, I would say to the waiter, bring me bread, and onions, and tomato, and cheese, and I'll have an onion and cheese tomato sandwich. And I would not eat the wombo stew, and I would not eat the chicken. Forget it. To this day, I still don't like eating chicken made by somebody else.
Well, you learn those lessons just once, but I've heard the story, and you can perhaps correct us here, sir. But the one thing you should not fake is to say that a dog or some wild animal got hold of you, and now you got rabies, or you think you have rabies, because they're going to inject you something like 12 injections around your navel. What do you call that thing in your pants? Is that true? Is there any truth in that?
Yeah, I had a distant relationship to rabies in Southwest. There was a crowd called Atlas that used to do C-160 tours, and they would do trooping for us and so on. And they got tasked to go and fetch a chap at Ndangwa, civilian at Ndangwa, and fly him to Windhoek. So here was a C-160 flying one guy. And the chap asked for water during the flight, and he had to be given water through a straw. And after they got him to Windhoek, they were told that he was a rabies patient who was symptomatic. Rabies is pretty much fatal. If you're symptomatic, the chances are 99.9% you're not going to make it. Now they've been told this guy had rabies, and the entire crew had to go for these intra-abdominal injections to avoid. Although I don't really understand why. I don't think it's not easily contractable. You basically have to be bitten or spat upon by the person. But they all had to go for the injections. We had rabies vaccine in case, but we never actually got anybody bitten.
I have three questions for you, which I was really thinking about. The first one is, they said these malaria pills, besides being, of course, extremely bitter, I mean, it is dreadful, because the man could stand there, hand you the pill, put it in your mouth, and then he gives a glass of water to the guy next to you. So you have to chew this for a while. Okay, well, we got him later. You regretted that. But they say service takes away your suntan. Is there any truth in that?
I don't know. I remember this one. This is why the troops didn't want to take them. It's because they said it stopped their sun tanning. I think it's an anecdotal thing. I think it's a story behind which there may or may not be some fact. What I did discover, because I burn easily, what I did discover is that there's a medication made by Burroughs Wellcome called Actidol, and they had a long-acting one called Proactidol. And if I was going to be in the sun, I would take some vitamin A, and I would take a Proactidol, and that would prevent me burning. It was the weirdest thing. It actually worked.
You see, this is where experience coming. But now I have really a question here which has been bothering me for 40 years. How do a pharmacist actually read the handwriting of an average doctor?
Advanced hieroglyphics.
I'm sorry.
It's a pharmaceutical joke. I mean, we always said that in our course we would do advanced hieroglyphics. No, there are some writings. I think you get used to it, and you get to interpret very well. There was one doctor whose handwriting I could not interpret, and that was the dermatologist who served 3 military hospitals. When he started, he was a civilian doctor who would come and do a session. At the beginning of the session, you could read it, and as it progressed, it got worse and worse and worse and worse. And he was a not nice person. And I got this prescription I could not read. So I phoned through to the outpatients. I said to the sister, please ask doctor what he prescribed for this patient. So she spoke to him and she says, doctor says that if the pharmacist brings him the prescription, he'll write it in block letters. So I said, you tell the doctor that he either tells me what it is or the patient can take it and go to town and go have it dispensed privately. Oh, doctor says it's Medrol 4 milligram. Thank you. But he was a right royal, unpleasant guy.
But I
But never mind.
suppose they are not the norm, is it? The one thing I'm asking you is because in the legal profession, I found that the female attorneys had something to prove. God knows what. There were no reason for that. They were clever. They were on the top of a class anyway. They were bright people. They do the same problem with a female medical doctor, sir, that they felt they had to prove themselves.
No, I don't think so. We never had, I don't want to say never had. I think the hospitals may have had women doctors, but generally speaking, we didn't have many women doctors. Certainly they didn't do national service. All the national servicemen were males. Things may have changed in the new Defence Force. I don't know. I can't tell you. But some doctors had something to prove and some doctors didn't. It's like anything. Some people are nice, some people are not nice. They're just people.
How strict was the control over the prescription medicine? In other words, the serious drugs and things. Because we did read, there were some people who came out in the 1990s and they wrote these books, all rubbish, where they say, no, these guys could just, use those drugs and have a party with it and sell it on the black market. But it wasn't like that in the police, so you had to sign for those things. And
Yeah.
God will not help you if you cannot give a good reason. It's like ammunition or explosives. Same story.
The what we call Schedule 6 and Schedule 7 drugs, things like morphine, omnipon, pethidine, pentazocine, and so on, tilidine, they were all controlled within hospitals, sick bays, medical depots. But having said that, these ops company medics that I spoke about got what we call an NCO bag. It was a huge canvas bag filled with a standard range of instruments, medicines, and tools, and which they would pack extra with things like dextrose and saline and so on for use in the field. And in there would be morphine in a multi-dose vial. So your unqualified, when I say unqualified, they're not formally qualified in the civilian sense. Your unqualified man out in the field is carrying morphine. They did take the morphine away from the ops company medics and they left them with pentazocine and tilidine, which is not written up anyway. And if they'd wanted to, they could steal it and do whatever they like with it. The old 1.5 MSD, before we computerized, in the lab proper, which we didn't use for storage, you could open a drawer and there vials of morphine rolling around in there. And I got a bit uptight about it one time, and I had all the morphine collected and locked up in a steel case. But it wasn't on my books proper. Once we were computerized, everything was on the books and in a locked up room and so on until it got issued. Funny enough, one of the things that went wrong is the sick bay used to indent off us like anybody else did. And they put their indent in, and amongst us were some scheduled medicines. And a couple of days after they'd taken it away, I got a message from somebody that on the civilian rubbish dump had been found morphine and whatever. And it turned out that this was the sick bay's stock. So somehow it never ended up at the sick bay. It ended up on the civilian dump. And to this day, I have no idea how that happened. Don't know what they did. We had a nurse that was abusing scheduled medicine. And we knew it was her, but we never could catch her. We did do an inspection on her bungalow the one time where we even went into the ceiling and so on. Never found anything. Could not understand that one. The sick bay, Grootfontein, the water in Grootfontein was incredibly hard. Anything that was a solar heated thing would last about 2 or 3 weeks, and then it didn't work anymore because it just got chalked up. They had a reverse osmosis or an ion catalysis thing for purifying water, and this thing stopped working too because the water was just so absolutely hard it couldn't work. Oh, I just thought of something else. The X-ray facility, the building was built in a kind of an H shape. It was a precast building. And the theater was in one arm. And at the far end of that particular arm was the X-ray facility. And they did it like that so that the X-ray machine could be rolled into the theater if they needed it in theater. Otherwise, patients went down the outside into the X-ray department. And after, I don't know how many years, somebody did a test, and they found that the wall between the X-ray department and the theater was not X-ray opaque, which meant that everybody in theater had been irradiated from the day that they started. I don't know how they dealt with that either. I wasn't there anymore when that was discovered. But yeah.
Is it, now that you're looking back, so I mean, you're now 72 years old, you tell me, can we trust our pharmacists today? You know, the young guy was standing there, looking very clever, and all computerized, you know. Can we trust it?
My son lives here in Edgemead. He's a very long walk or very short drive away from me now. And he got some medication from a pharmacy here in Edgemead, so a civilian pharmacy. And they made a mistake. But he picked it up and he went back to them. I've been to the same pharmacy once, and all we do now is we check when we get a medication to make sure that we've got the right stuff. You probably hear that when I refer to medications, I sometimes use the trade name, and I also sometimes use the active ingredient name, because that's how we were taught. I was taught to work by active ingredient, not the trade name. And this whole Confor system worked by active ingredient. And I try this when I go to the pharmacies. I will ask for the active ingredient, and I must say I'm impressed. They have worked out what I'm asking for without any palaver. Whereas in the old days, I found that you would walk in and say, chlordiaz epoxide, and the guy had no idea what you're talking about. In fact, I was still a student, and a chappie I was working with, a pharmacist I was working with, made me learn active ingredient names. I had to learn 10 on a day. And it served me well, because when I got into the military, that's all they worked by. So I talk about pentazocine instead of Sosagon. Sosagon was the trade name.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something about ketamine or something. I know.
Ketelar and ketamine.
He's
Yeah.
actually a doctor these days.
Ketamine is a drug of abuse now. It's one of the major drugs of abuse. It's normally only used in the veterinary service.
Yeah, but now there's another problem which we have in Africa, I suppose, is fake drugs
Yes.
from India or China. How serious is that? I mean, lots of the people here travel, of course. I mean, they go out and they might get ill, and they. What do you suggest?
I'm not on top of that now at the present moment because I've deregistered. I no longer pay my registration fees. I'm not acting as a pharmacist anymore. But I'm not aware of many fake drugs in South Africa. It could be. I don't look for them. It is a big problem in Northern Africa. Serious problem. Chap I knew used to do work higher up in Africa, and some medication that he was supposed to be getting was contaminated with something because it came from some unreliable source. The South African government has bought medicine from India. We used to get medicine from Dr. Reddy's. I mean, a firm called Dr. Reddy's already doesn't sound right to me, but it seemed to be all right. The only thing that I will mention is my last job that I had as a qualified pharmacist was pharmacist at George Provincial Hospital, where I became their first chief pharmacist. Now, I mentioned earlier thiopentone pentothal. That used to be the induction for surgery. And we stopped getting the May Baker pentothal, and we started getting a different company's thiopentone. And one of the anesthetists at George Hospital moaned from the first day. She said that she had to double up the dose to get an effective dose. And there was nothing I could do about it because I was not allowed to get off tender. That's contrary to government regulation. So we had to sit with this thiopentone and use it. And I had a theory about it, and it seems like my theory is probably right. In organic chemistry, which is what most medicine is, it's mostly organic compounds. In organic chemistry, it has to do with carbon. Carbon forms 4 bonds. If you have a different thing attached, 4 different things attached to the carbon atom, you get a situation where the molecule forms 2 forms, and they mirror images. They like your hands are the same, but they're not. They're mirror images. It does this with the molecule, and the one molecule is active and the other one is not active. If you make your medicine with the active one only, it becomes very active. If you make it with a mixture, it's only half as active. Now, this sometimes has advantageous effects. Quinine is a compound that has enantiomer, stereoisomerism. The one molecule is highly active against malaria and has minor cardiac effects. The other one has major cardiac effects, but minor anti-malarial effect. And as I say, this is an advantage because you can split them and use the one for malaria and use the other one for heart problems. And that was my theory, is that the pentothal we were getting was a mixture, and it wasn't as good as what it used to be. The problem now is, I think this has to do with America. Because America used pentothal as part of their lethal injection program, nobody will make it anymore because they don't want to be they don't want their product to be part of this system. So you cannot get pentothal anywhere in the world. Maybe places like Russia, I don't know. But certainly not in the free world. You don't get it.
Yeah, this is really fascinating to me. And, we've been speaking 2 hours and it felt like 5 minutes. There's so much I still want to ask, but I just want to say to all of you, yeah, we're not giving medical advice, but we're just discussing medical stuff. I see the major is also nodding here. We're not giving you medical advice. Go and see your doctor, see your pharmacist, whatever. We're just telling you how it was in the old days, and we're learning a lot at the same time. Now, can I ask you, if there's anybody here listening to you who, of course, know you or have heard about you or remember those days, do you have any message for them?
Something prompted me talking about the vet. The vet that I met at Grootfontein was he was when I was captain, he was captain. When I was major, he was major. It was a Dr. Anderson, Donald Anderson. And Dr. Anderson and I would meet from time to time. We'd have coffee together and chat about this, that, and the other thing. And he came to me the one time and he said, have I received any instruments for him? I said, I have no idea. What instrument are you looking for? And he was looking for a horse castrating machine. It's a huge thing like a hedge clipper, but it's stainless steel, and it had jaws that would do that. He said, no, never seen one. When I was up at Ondangwa, at that time when with our 3 theatres, the team that were the doctors that were already there, I was in their bungalow, and I found this weird machine, and I said, what on earth is this? They said they had no idea, it just turned up one day. I know what it is. And I took it back with me to Grootfontein, and when I saw Donald, I said, Donald, is this what you're looking for? How his instrument got to Ondangwa, I have no idea, but that is what happened. About that particular time in Ondangwa, my 3 theatres are there, I'm there, the Professor Lawson is there, all these brass from one military hospital are there, and the Tiffies give us a generator for our use. And they set this thing up, they've got it going, they connected up, and they blew everything we had. They had the phases wrong. All our electrical equipment went. And that was the particular ops that South Africa went in, that Dieter Gerhardt had told them we're coming. So, in fact, nothing happened. On another aspect about that particular visit, the day it was supposed to all happen, I woke up early. It was also because there was a lot of noise. The helicopters taking the troops to Angola were going out. So I got up. I gave up trying to sleep. I got up. Black, as dark as anything. And while I'm there, we were at the one end of the runway, so that when cassovacs were brought to us, they could just taxi into us and deliver the cassovacs. While I'm standing there at the end of the runway, I hear noise at the other end. So I thought, I want to see what this is. And eventually the 2-seater Mirage came running down the runway and took off right in front of me. In the black, beautiful Mirage, the flame coming out the back, it was as long as the Mirage was. And as he lifted, the tail hit the runway, bent like that. That is there with my vision of Etoshapan at the break of day, up there in the air, hanging out the back door. And that was the reconnaissance Mirage going to take their photographs. I also saw a Mirage at a later time that had nearly been hit by a SAM-7 missile. They took the engine out, and the engine was standing at Ondangwa, And instead of being a sort of round format, it was slightly flattened on one side. If you give me a moment, I want to go and fetch something. For those of you who know, this is a 5-0 Browning shell. That's the famous 5-0 Browning shell. I think this is a 20mm Bofors. And these two are very special. One is silver colored, the one is black. That is a 30mm Mirage cannon shell. It's not fired by a pin, it's fired electronically. The one is armor piercing, the other one is high explosive. I do not know which one is which. This was made for me by the South African Air Force guys when I was leaving Grootfontein the first time. I think that's a 9mm. I think this is a 5.56. I presume these are Bofors here, but this one is very, very special. On the underside, it says Kaart Elek Eng Start. Three of these were loaded into the Canberra bomber. And when they started the motor, it was started by firing one of these. If it didn't catch, they fired the second one. If it didn't catch, they fired the third one. It's not actually a shell. It's a jet engine starter. Old-fashioned 303. .62 plastic. This is a blank. It doesn't fire anything. What I didn't bring now is a Martini Henry shell I have. The Martini Henry dates from the First Anglo-Boer War and the Second Anglo-Boer War. Interesting story about the Second Anglo-Boer War is the famous South African was a chap by the name of Deneys Reitz. He wrote the book of the Boers on the Veld called Adrift on the Veld. And he said whenever they were in a contact with the Tommies, with the British, some of the Boers had Martini Henrys, some of them had more modern rifles, and some had been issued the Mausers that the Transvaal Republic had bought. In the contact, you did not want to be next to the guy with Martini Henry. For the simple reason the Martini Henry burnt black powder, and when he fired, it made a huge white cloud of smoke. So the British knew exactly where he was. So he didn't want to be there. My grandfather on the other side, who used to blow up railway lines for General de Wet, they would sometimes use Martini Henry breech block and mechanism for setting off the dynamite. I know this is not modern warfare, but my grandfather came from a big family, and he had a number of half-brothers and so on. And the youngest one was Ignatius. And they were in a camp one night, and they got a message that the British were close by. So they saddled up and moved out. And Lars was sent off to saddle up his horse. My grandfather found him. I mean, he was a youngster. He was about 12 or 13. My grandfather found him trying to put the saddle on an ox. So he put him in a wagon and let him sleep it off. There was a different time that some of the Boers were as young as 12 and 13, and some were old men in their 60s. Another time. But here's me, a product of the Afrikaans side, and not exactly English, but Anglo side. So my home language was English, but I'm half Afrikaans. In the military, I learned to speak Afrikaans very well.
It is fascinating that most people say that they learn to speak Afrikaans very quickly. I was about to ask you about that. I mean, you're very Anglo-sounding names. Whether that was ever a problem to you, I mean, some Afrikaners.
Yes. I think it caused me not to be progressed. When I was going to go to Southwest for the third time for 15 MSD, I asked for top secret clearance and it was denied. And I said, but I get documents which are top secret. How can you deny me? No. So, and although I had done the course, I didn't get my promotion at the end of year. So I let it go. Yes, I'm not going to mention names, but a whole group of people in the medical staff personnel group, from the chief of personnel down, names appear in a book called the Super Afrikaners, and these were the Broeder Bonders. In fact, my first father-in-law was a Broeder Bonder, and I still asked him if he would talk to them and say, don't advance me, just leave me alone, let me progress normally. And he said, no, you can't do that.
Yeah, for those of you who don't understand what we're talking about, this is almost like a Freemasons and Afrikaner thing, and they really control the scenes behind the. I think that at some stage, unless you were a Broeder Bonder or a Broeder, you couldn't advance above Colonel. And even like Commandant, I'm not saying it's true, that's what I've heard. And every single general, most certainly, were involved with this, and every dominie, many magistrates, yeah, they were evil bunch behind the scenes, because for a simple reason that your secret societies makes it unfair. It's inherently unfair if a man is not just on his character and achievements, but just on whatever stupid ceremony is underwent. So that would be totally wrong. They still exist, by the way. You want to show us your dog, Major?
His actual name is Alexander, but that's too big a name for a small dog, so he's called Xander.
He's not called after General Alexander, or Field Marshal as he used to be. I recall my dad.
Really having a problem today.
Yeah, it is a bit coughing in the background, but that's not a big deal. You can sort that out. He's not that different from a human, is he?
Not very, no. Look, a strange thing has happened. When I was sent to Cape Town, I was going to drive down. They said, no, that doesn't happen. Your car will be railed. Okay. And the day before, I'm trying to get the car railed. Now, the military have to do this for me. And they didn't know what to do. So I said, look, we need to get this thing done. And it dragged on for a whole day when this thing was just not getting done. So eventually I get a phone call and I have a voice on the other side. And I got annoyed. And I went pop at this person. And I said, you know, I'm now supposed to go. Now, how can I go if this vehicle is not on the train and so on? And the guy backpedaled and apologized and so on. And I thought, I wonder who I'm talking to. So I said, who is this? And he outranked me by 2 ranks. But it's just one of those things. Yeah. And a not entirely dissimilar thing happened. We had an ops coming up, and these guys were brought up from the Republic, and some what do they call them? I can't even remember what they call them now, but they're the guys who had been through national service and were still on the books, and they would do camps from time to time. And all of a sudden, these three guys walk into my office, three commandants, and they start picking me out because where are their MO bags, the medical officers' bags? And I say, I don't even know about you guys. Why would I have MO bags for you if I don't even know that you're here? And they were making a big fuss. And eventually I said to them, you've walked into my unit. You haven't asked permission to enter my property. You're giving me a hard time without me knowing what the hell's going on here. So you either shut up or get off my property. So they shut up. I phoned down to General Mark and I said, I got these three guys standing here. And he went pop. They were supposed to have collected their MO bags in Pretoria. They didn't. So they flew them up and they came and they fetched them. And they were a lot quieter then.
Yeah, it just shows you.
Yeah.
It just shows you, you're not, what I always say to people is don't always think you're in the wrong. Most often you're actually not in the wrong. And then it takes moral, guts to say, look, I'm not wrong.
I'm not perfect. I make mistakes from time to time. I like to admit when I make a mistake. Like Brigadier Panzergray, he didn't know what the answer was. I mean, for a brigadier to say he doesn't know, it's like, what?
Yeah, we forget we're humans. We had a very famous English judge called Lord Coke. It had nothing to do with Coca-Cola, I can assure you. And he had a famous trial going, and it was about piracy or something like that. No, he's, if I can remember correctly, I don't practice law anymore for many years. Well, this is fascinating because these guys were on a ship and the ship sank, and they got into one of his rooibootjies, and then they decided they had to eat one of them, of themselves, to survive, and so they drew lots. And as it happened, they ate the youngest, the cabin boy, after giving him some time to make peace with the afterlife. And then they threw the body overboard when they saw the sails approach, and the Royal Navy picked him up. But of course, now his body is drifting next to their little life raft, and so they got up for murder. And it's very fascinating that Lord Coke said, I may be wrong, I frequently am wrong, but I'm never in doubt. And it struck to me, that's 150 years ago, a guy came out with this saying. And perhaps there's a lesson in that. There's self-confidence is a good thing, especially in your occupation. There's no way in hell that you can start around and say, well, I'm not too sure about this pill, but any, meeny, now. You have to know.
Yeah. You touched on an interesting thing there. I hadn't thought of that. The army guys suddenly realized they had a guy on the base who they could rope in to do courts martial. So I got roped in. Never been in a courts martial before in my life, and it's a triumvirate. It's a president of the court and two others. So I was roped in as one of the two others. And that was an interesting period, is to sit on these courts martial, hear evidence, and so on, to the point that I asked to do the military law course, denied. But okay, whatever. That was an interesting period. I think the very first case I sat on was a rifleman who had been AWOLing. He'd been running away and so on. He'd been a couple of times. And this guy had a terrible face. He had one of the worst cases of acne I'd ever seen in my life. And this was somehow brought into the subject, is that this acne thing. So we said, all right, we sentenced him to go to one military hospital, get treatment for his acne and so on. That actually got chucked out because it was not a decision we could make. We couldn't decide on treatment. We could decide on punishment or no punishment, but not on a treatment. But that's as may be. At one stage, we were court-martialing one of the workshop chappies. I think he was a two-stripe corporal or a sergeant or something. He had taken a welding machine home and used it to do some sort of private welding. So this case sort of rambled on, and I was a little on the boring side and so on. And at some point they asked us whether we had any questions. I said, I got a question. Yeah, I said, are these welding machines numbered? Yes, they have a serial number. I said, okay, can we see this welding machine? And the accusing officer withdrew the case immediately. It turned out they could not produce the machine and say, this was the machine. So they just withdrew the case. And another one that I found very interesting, Bushmanland, off to one side on the road to Runtu is Bushmanland. And there were military bases there where we had Bushman soldiers. And the vehicles that used to move the logistics was a huge truck called a Magirus, and the later model, which was also Magirus but was made under license, was called a Quaffel. It was a anti-mine base and so on. And this troopie had an argument of some sort with his one-pip lieutenant. So the one-pip lieutenant said to him, take your Magirus and go home. So this guy took his Magirus and he drove home. They found the Magirus parked in Sea Point, Cape Town, and tracked him down and arrested him. And they were charging him with theft of the Magirus. They charged him with theft of state fuel and so on. And when it got to the end, we said, but hang on, you're asking a soldier to identify whether the command that he's been given is legal or illegal. He's not in a position to do this. He was told to take his Magirus and go. That's what he did. And it can be demonstrated that he paid for his own fuel, so you can't even charge him for using state fuel. No case. Thrown out. And I found that so interesting. Yes, we had done law, but the law we had done had been pharmaceutical law, laws pertaining to pharmacy. So this was a completely new field for me.
It seems to me that if you want to grow in the old army, and I'm not talking about the new one because that's not the topic here, you could.
No.
It was possible for you to grow and do other things besides that what you were appointed. Now, that's a good thing, isn't it?
Yes, I agree. In a way, I enjoyed the vegspan and veggroep courses because we were, especially vegspan, where we had to do with the actual army side of things. We learned about the artillery, we learned about mobile infantry and so forth, and we were creating plans for attack, defense, or retreat, and so on, in military terms, whereas the veggroep was about a medical battalion group. So it was a little different. But yes, in a way that were enjoyable, in a way not so enjoyable. I mean, at the end of the courses, we were not entirely sane because we'd had so little sleep for a week.
Is it possible that a medical officer can command a battle group?
A battle group proper? It's unlikely. Put into the situation, I had sort of considered this if ever it happened to me. is if I was in a battle situation with me either as a captain or as a major, and I had a one-pip infantryman lieutenant, I would say to the lieutenant, you know what you're doing, you carry on. Because that's his field of expertise, not my field of expertise.
So the rank system was, even though it's the same rank, there were very definite limitations. Can I use that word? I don't want to use the word. It's the wrong word. But, you know, English is my whatever language. You're still an officer. I mean, it's the same commission which was signed by the president.
Yes.
And so theoretically, you can do what any other officer can do.
Yes. This is why the Surgeon General decided that we had to qualify because there was this thing with the army saying, but your guys are not non-combatants. You see? So yes, we might be non-combatants, but we still qualified to be generals or colonels or whatever the case may be. There's another point I was going to make about this. There was a kind of a move, especially amongst national servicemen doctors, that they don't wear rank. We each got a badge which indicated your qualification. As a national serviceman, the pharmacists didn't get the badge. The doctors got a cloth one that they would put on their brown uniform and a metal one that they wore on the step-out uniform. And that was the caduceus with the two snakes and the wings. When I became permanent force, I got the pharmacist's caduceus. There's no cloth version, it's only the metal one. And I still have my caduceus. They had one for nursing officers, which was different again. The pharmacist one doesn't have wings. And at the top of the stick was a mortar and pestle, that mixing bowl. The nursing staff had a different one. The hygiene officers and pen pushers had a badge which had the two crossed feathers. I think there was one for psychologists. I'm not sure. And there was one for welfare officers. And some of the national servicemen doctors felt that they shouldn't wear rank. They should wear caduceus on an epaulet instead. So they're doctor, they're not lieutenant or captain or whatever the case is. That didn't happen in my time. It certainly wasn't under serious consideration. Coming back to the tiffy idea, a tiffy being a mechanic. So I'm a pill tiffy. A doctor is a body tiffy. A dentist is a tooth tiffy. The welfare officer was a seal tiffy, a soul tiffy, because he was supposed to look after the souls of the troops.
Well, it was always great to see the medical people around. You know, there are people who say that, yeah, you go to the medic and he offers you a Disprin or something for whatever is wrong with you. I don't know if that's quite true, sir. Is that true in your experience?
No, but sort of leading off from that, way back in 76, we would get these pieces of paper from the bases and they would have a list of what they wanted from us. And I discovered apricots. Apricot is like a little peach sort of thing. Apricot. Why is he asking me for apricots? I'm not a fruit vendor. So we ignore this. And when I went to 15MSD the first time, same thing started happening. We get the little list and in there would be apricots. And it happened so often that eventually I thought there's got to be something about this. There's something I'm missing. So I sat there saying, apricots, apricots, apricots. I got it. We used to have a pill available, which was aspirin, phenacetin, and codeine, and they were called APCODs. And these guys sit in the lecture, and the guy says to them, apricots. So apricots is what he asked for. And all this time I've been saying, don't know what they want, don't give them anything there, don't know what it is. And eventually it got to me, okay, now I know what it is. So, but yeah, I think we had one of the best medical aids available for the military, permanent force and the national servicemen. Is you pretty much got what there was, what was available. So yeah, you got top notch. I believe that the medical service that we gave was A1. General Coecroft, the first Surgeon General I served under, sort of guaranteed the army that every soldier was within 10 minutes of trained medical aid. And I forget what the time period was for surgical medical aid, sort of thing. So our ops company medics were actually overloaded when they went into battle, because they went into battle with the troops. Because they have their rifle, they'd have their kit, and they'd have this NCO bag with them. So they really had a hard time. But they were right there with the troops in the field. And I think we learned that from the Israelis.
Yes, I recall we were very proud of our medical services, and it was conflicting, is that the word? You know, if something can go wrong with you, I mean, if somebody shoots you, it's an ugly sight, and if they can get you to hospitals or to the surgeons, there's a good chance. I must tell you this one joke about the doctor. I don't know if this happened, but he asked me one day, he said to me, now, Sergeant, what would you do if we need to operate on someone and we don't have Pentadine or something? What are you going to do? I said, so I'll just kick him in the head. You know, what else? What can you do now? In the police, we are a bit more, less formal than the army. But I was worrying about this fellow because I knew he was heading up to something. And he said to me, no, you don't do that. You just ask him to shout. I said, what? And he says, well, think about it. If you start shouting, then air must come out of your lungs, obviously. Otherwise, there's no noise. So what you do is when he takes a deep breath to get this, you just cut. When you start cutting, he passes out. Now, that was his theory. I don't know if it's true, but I know that a person like Dr. Eric Solomon's watching here, doctor, I don't think it's true. But if you ever, is it possible, sir, to cheat science? Is it possible that a pill can have an effect what it really ought not to have? Is such a thing? I know people can get an allergic reaction, of course.
Yeah. I went out to the patients. All right. Like I say, we had this whole range of anesthetics that we could offer those days, starting with thiopentone and moving through Forbantal and propofol and so on. In fact, what is used today is propofol. And of course, ketamine. A doctor used to come with Dr. Alan White from Addington Hospital, Durban, and he was not a qualified anesthetist, but he was the anesthetist, and he knew anesthetics. And I asked him the one time, and he said, even if you got ketamine, he'll put the bloke out, not a problem. We just supply what we got, they'll put the bloke out. So we were pretty gin to have options and other options if those options were not available.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that because I felt quite sorry for kicking the guy in the head if he's already wounded. But I suppose what else can you do? It's marvelous talking to you. I have to tell you, sir, this was fantastic to me. I'm sure you're going to come back because most definitely there's going to be a whole bunch of questions here which I can't answer. But thank you. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I think I've needed to do this for a long time because the facility's never been there.
And there's a lesson to be learned in that. I want to say to all of you once again, guys, legacy conversations got nothing to do with the parabats. It's special forces, whatever. We want to hear all your stories. What we learned today is what will never be in a book, probably, unless one of you people write your own book. And so again, you're welcome here. Please come and tell us. I've learned a lot. I'm really grateful because, I always saw you people walking around there, and of course you try to avoid America if you can, for obvious reasons. I do apologize for this alarm in the background. That's the front door. We're alone in the hotel, and we just need someone down there probably delivering something. So I've got to run there as well. But again, thank you, Major. Such a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you.